Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for I think what should be a really amazing session. We're joined by three brilliant speakers. Today we've got Sina Solar, who is a superstar graffiti artist. We've got Jimmy Turner, who's an interdisciplinary researcher at a very exciting new institute at Edinburgh called the Binks Hub. And we're joined by our own Gemma Lucas, who is a fantastic colleague in the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health. So they're going to be talking today for, well, I'll get onto the structure, but just around the themes of artistic collaborations and the intersection between creative arts and research, amongst many other things. So it's a slightly different arrangement today. We're going to have it really, the session will be split into three sessions. The first, we're going to have some reflections shared by Sina, Jimmy, and Gemma on their collaborations, and then in the second section we're going to have some crafting time in breakout rooms, and people in person will be able to obviously stay in the centre. We're not going to distribute you elsewhere, and then in the final session we're going to come back and share some reflection on our experiences of doing this creative work together. We won't necessarily have a formal break like we usually do, just because in the breakout room time and even in the feedback, really, you should feel free to get up and walk around, make yourself a cup of drink, and have a loo break if you need it. Yes, a much more sort of loose structure in that way than usual. I would just like to make a plug, seems as I have everybody's attention is really glued onto the screen at the moment, for our next session in May, which should be a great session on abortion mobilities in Latin America and Europe. We'll put up something on the Eventbrite page for that, and that'll be on the 17th of May. So I think, other than wanting to say preemptively a massive thank you to Amanda, our captioner, who always does such a fantastic job, and we're very lucky to have with us today. I'm going to hand over to Sina, Jimmy, and Gemma for the start of the talk. I will share my screen so that we can all see the great material you've produced for us too.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jimmy Turner. I'm a research fellow at the Binks Hub at the University of Edinburgh, about which I will be very happy to talk later. But we are determined to keep our opening introductory third to the session as brief as we possibly can, so we leave plenty of time for arts and crafts basically in the middle. So today we're going to be speaking to the title Artists Researching and Researchers Crafting, Artistic Residencies as Sites for Entering into Relationships with Concepts. And that's about as academic as I hope the language gets and remains for the rest of the afternoon, to be perfectly honest. As you'll have noted, I'm going to start things off and give a brief introduction and then introduce one of the residencies that we're going to talk about. And then I'll pass the mic over to Gemma Lucas, who will give an introduction to the second residency that we'll be talking about. And then we'll hand the mic over to Sina for her to talk about her thoughts, feelings, experiences, and insights about the residency process. So if you could go to the next screen, please, Martin.
Yeah.
There we go. First off, delighted to say that Sina has specially for the event designed myself, Gemma, and herself some little avatars. So I'm very, very pleased and proud of mine. It's now become my profile picture on basically everything, and I'm wearing the hat specially today, so there's no mistaking that it's me there. And I'll say as well, I've never looked better than I do through the eyes and hands and heart of my dear friend Sina. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about two residencies. First one, the Sina Solar and Wild Hive residency, was initiated by Gemma Lucas and worked on by Gemma, Sina, and another artist, B. as part of Gemma's work at the Arts and Culture Exeter organisation, and was also funded by the Wellcome Centre, who are hosting us today, and the ESRC Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership. So give a shout out to all of those organisations who supported it, but I won't say any more about it. Gemma will come back and explain what that was all about after I have finished. I will, however, be talking about the Residencia Nobela, Nobela residency, which we did as part of a GCRF project called Global Grace, on which I collaborated with a team of researchers in Brazil, people from PUC-Rio, the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio, the Observatorio de Favelas, Favela Observatory NGO, IMJA, the Instituto Maria e João Aleixo, and apologies for the captioner there, but IMJA will be more than good enough there, I think, and Promundo, and they're both also NGOs. And I did it while I was working at a university whose name I will not mention, but you can read in the bottom right-hand corner, and hopefully that doesn't constitute breaking a boycott, because I forgot to take that out before today. Okay, can we skip to the next slide, please? Okay, it's not my intention to give anything resembling a full categorization of artistic residencies and the ways in which they can and have been used by researchers and in collaboration and participation with researchers. Instead, I'll just talk about what I think are probably the four main kinds of activities that will happen within collaborations in a residency format between researchers and artists. And none of these are mutually exclusive. Very often there'll be a mixing of these. So the first one, which I've called Artists Residing with Academics, is perhaps the most familiar model for most people. It's very often best known when an artist goes to do a period of residency in a big hard science kind of lab or institute. So places like CERN, for example, people may have read of artists going into CERN and producing artworks inspired by the residency there. With that kind of activity, more often than not, the researchers will just continue on doing the research they're doing, and the artist will almost act as a kind of ethnographer, to put it in academic terms. The inverse, in a sense, of that is researchers researching artists. And this would be, broadly speaking, where an artistic residency is happening and a researcher or researchers will accompany that artistic residency with the object of their research being the artist's process and the residency process. Third model is a bit more of a molding and melding of those two options, which I've called artists making art and researchers researching, but together. This would tend to refer to projects within which both artists and researchers are both working towards the same goals, but their activities are more or less independent of each other. So the researchers, the scientists, social scientists, scholars from whichever discipline kind of get on with doing the work that they're doing, but in conversation with artists who will then very often produce works of art which are inspired by or aim to communicate the findings of the research. The final of this very kind of rough sketched typology would be what we did, which I called artists researching and researchers crafting. And by this I mean a residency within which a researcher, such as myself or such as Gemma, will participate fully in the length of the residency with some artists, or an artist even, and will both conduct research and produce art. And similarly, the artists will both research and produce art. So it's an attempt to flatten the distinctions, I suppose, between the two different roles, and offer up insights on both sides that we've certainly found came up when a researcher such as myself, who doesn't consider themselves an artist or didn't consider themselves an artist, is sort of thrown into an artistic mode of thinking and acting and using artistic practices. So if you go to the next slide, please, Martin. Okay, so a little bit more detail. We conducted the residency at the Galpão Bela Maré, which is written at the top, which is an art gallery in the Maré Favela sort of a conjunction of favelas in the north of Rio de Janeiro. And it was part of the Global Grace project, which is now finished. And we did this for 2 months through October and November 2019. There were 4 of us participating. So if you look to the photograph, this is a photograph taken on the first day the 4 of us all met. We have from left to right, Amora, known as Amorinha. We have Sina, who you will see and hear from in a few moments, myself, and Tiago Toshi. I'm an anthropologist and gender studies scholar and an enthusiastic amateur woodworker, and they are all graffiti artists, as well as other things. The prospectus for the residency was that we would explore together through art the concept of masculinities otherwise. And for that, we drew on very particularly the Latin American stream within decolonial theory, where a concept known as the otherwise has been developed. And I find it most useful to think of it through Arturo Escobar, who's a Colombian anthropologist, who wrote that the purpose of researching the otherwise is an attempt to craft another space for the production of knowledge, an other way of thinking, un paradigma otro, the very possibility of talking about, and the subtitles have covered up the bottom of the screen, so I can't read what it says at the bottom, and I've forgotten the exact quote.
Worlds and knowledge is otherwise.
Thank you, worlds and knowledge is otherwise. So that's what we set out to do. We set out to try and come up through art and through our own internal research together with each other. So it was very autoethnographic, but collaboratively so. We spoke to other researchers, spent time with other researchers on the Global Grace projects. We spent a lot of time thinking about consuming and talking about popular culture. And the film Midnight was, for example, a very influential work of art, which we then drew on and used. And over the course of 2 months, we conducted this project. So Martin, if you could pop to the next slide, please. Okay, and these images are really just to try and give a hint of what we did and to emphasize that we approached this very much as we might a research project. So we had a period of research where we spent a lot of time, again, discussing with each other, exploring ideas, but also exploring through art and artistic languages, the kind of ideas around masculinity and how it might be considered and lived and experienced and represented otherwise. Then we decided, we'd had the idea from the beginning, but we made the firm decision that we would like to stage an exhibition. We'd like to produce some original artworks and exhibit them in the gallery where we were working. So we had a period of logistics. We bought artistic materials. We bought several huge panels of plywood, which we would later paint on. And we spent time working together to figure out, thank you, Martin, to figure out what it was that we needed in order to produce the artwork that our research together demanded of us. Then once finished, we curated, which was also very much like a period of analysis for us. Yeah, we thought deeply about the ideas, we'd explored the things that we wanted to do and how best to order them, present them, categorize them, and how best to put the different artworks that we produced in conversation with each other. And then finally, we put on an exhibition which coincided with an educational event which was being held at the gallery, which was organized by our colleagues on the Global Grace project as part of a multi-week course on art and masculinity in Brazil, which they put on. So we were able to use the exhibition as a way to speak to people who were researching and had been thinking and talking about academic research into art and masculinity. As well as reach an audience, primarily a local audience from Maré itself, of people who were interested in the kind of work we were doing and the kind of concepts that we were exploring together. You'll see on the right-hand side of the bottom picture, you'll be able to just see the side of the installation that we produced from the plywood. So on the next slide, we have a short video, just over a minute long, that Cinna produced, which is kind of shows our journey through the process of producing this installation, including all of those elements of research, logistics, curation, analysis, and dissemination. So if you could play that, Martin, please, that'd be great.
Ver a natureza morta. Ai, ai, meu Deus do céu, quanto eu sofri ao ver a natureza morta. Vi a mandioca pra farinha e o milho pra galinha e o capim para a vaquinha e o feijão quem compra gosta. Oi, vi a mandioca pra farinha e o milho pra galinha e o capim para a vaquinha e o feijão quem compra gosta. Que hilário, ai, ouvi eu vi chover em minha horta. Ai, ai, meu Deus do céu, quanto eu sofri ao ver a natureza morta. Ai, ai, meu Deus do céu, quanto eu sofri ao ver a natureza morta.
Okay, so the installation itself was drawn from the research and the thought and discussion that we did, and particularly in isolating the most damaging and oppressive masculinity, being the white capitalist heteronormative elite masculinity, and in terms of the representation on the installation, it's themed around the context within where we were in Brazil, but we were very much mindful of this presence, this oppressive presence being very, very much global, and that in producing the installation, which pitted the solitary, rich, white, straight, capitalist male on one side of a tug of war, able to hold on to power with just a finger and thumb, against a multitude of oppressed people who together were able to balance against him and resist his otherwise overwhelming power. Go to the next page, please, Martin. And then finally from me, I just wanted to show you some of the individual works that we produced as well, which were shown in the exhibition. So along the top is Amora's work, which was very, very much influenced by our discussions of the film Moonlight, through which she explores the almost completely unrepresented Black Afro-Brazilian homosexual male within a relationship and as a father, rather than as a deviant and hypersexualized kind of figure. And then along the bottom we have the wood carving of a flower, which is a self-portrait that I produced of myself, and was my way of understanding my way through the process, and doing so artistically opened up ways of thinking about masculinity and allowed me to finally distance myself from my masculinity and sort of come into a non-binary identity, which I occupy now, which I hadn't been able to find a way to do through over a decade of work with gender theory, with academia. It was through art that revelations and realizations were provoked and permitted within me. Tosh is the next along to the right, and he drew on sort of similar themes around the flower and the strength, the simultaneous strength and femininity, or associated femininity of the flower. And then finally, there was a triptych that Cinna produced, but I'm not going to say anything about that because Cinna will talk about that herself. So at this stage, hopefully that's given people at least an outline of what we did in the Nobela residency. And I'll pass the microphone over to Gemma to introduce the Wild Hive Cinna Solar residency.
Great, lovely. Can you hear me okay? Jimmy and Cinna, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Could we go to the next slide, please, Martin? Great, lovely, thank you. Okay, so yeah, so now I'm just going to talk briefly a little more about the project that I worked on with Cinna last year as another example of academic and artistic collaboration through artistic residency. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'll explain what we did and why, and particularly what emerged as a result of focusing on creative process rather than outputs, which I'll link to the kind of practical bit that we're going to do afterwards. So yeah, as Jimmy mentioned, the project was called Cinna Solar Wild Hive, and it was a collaboration primarily between myself as PhD researcher at the University of Exeter, a paper botanical artist, B. Watson, who you can see in the middle there on the screen, or on the PowerPoint. She has a paper flower arts organisation here in Exeter called Wild Hive Paper Flowers, and then graffiti artist Cinna Solar, who you've already met and you're going to hear from very shortly. So I developed this project as part of a 6-month work placement with Arts and Culture Exeter, which is an arts organisation that links the University of Exeter up with the wider arts and cultural network that exists across the Southwest. And yeah, with their support and with the support of the Wellcome Centre and funding from the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership, Cinna, B and I worked together for several weeks last year, firstly developing ideas, developing the project together, and then spending a couple of weeks collaborating through an online artistic residency. It was originally supposed to be in person, but it ended up being online because of COVID uncertainties. And then finally, Cinna and B each ran a workshop with groups from their local communities, so in Exeter for B and in Berlin for Cinna. The project's broad remit, which we decided on together at the start, was to think through creative practice to explore the topics of intersectionality and mental health. And we were clear from the start that the emphasis would be on the process of creative collaboration and thinking through doing. So in other words, we really wanted to kind of value the creative process. So to value the practice of creatively and collaboratively working together in and of itself, rather than seeing the process and the practice as a means to achieve some kind of particular predetermined goal or creative output. And that was really, really important to us all from the start. And it was important for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I've mentioned, we were working with Arts and Culture Exeter, and this focus on creative processes is at the heart of the work that they do. So they were really encouraging us to keep the project open-ended and exploratory and to play with possibilities and see what emerged. And this suited me really nicely, actually, as the academic collaborator, because my main priority was to learn from Cinna and B about the methodology and process of using artistic and creative practice to explore ideas. But this focus on process over output was also a way of working that both Cinna and B wanted to explore. It was one of the kind of main crossovers in their practices. So we talked a lot at the beginning of the project about the potential of kind of genuinely exploratory work and how rare it can be, but also how beneficial for creativity it can be to help to be funded, crucially to be funded to dedicate space and time to slowing down and experimenting and exploring and basically just seeing what happens, which can be uncomfortable actually. You know, there is something quite uncomfortable about that space of kind of genuine exploration without a fixed agenda, but I think we all agreed there was also something quite kind of expansive or like liberatory about that too. I mean, I know I learned a lot from kind of pushing at the edges of my comfort zone in that way through this project. So before we hear from Sina, I just wanted to outline briefly kind of what all of this meant in practical terms. So like what we did. So practically speaking, during the 2 weeks artists residency, Sina, B and I spent time making and creating together in a variety of ways. The thing that we did most consistently was talking, actually. Like we met every morning of the residency, the three of us would meet on Zoom and we'd have these long kind of meandering conversations with no agenda, just kind of allowing ideas to emerge or to evaporate or to crystallize, and then sometimes those ideas would make their way into the art that Sina and B were making. And then around these conversations, we individually went out and did loads of different things. So we went for walks, we visited cafes and museums, and we read books and we listened to poetry. We had a WhatsApp group and we shared loads of pictures of the things. Sina sent loads and loads of pictures of the things that she was doing in Berlin, which was super cool. And then of course, fragments from these experiences would weave into our conversations the next day. We would kind of bring the things that we'd been doing into the conversations we were then having on Zoom, kind of like adding ingredients to a pot. And we also wrote and painted and created in our own time and sometimes together. So sorry, could we go to the next slide actually, Martin? I should have said that a moment ago. So for example, so we also made and created. So and sometimes that was on our own at home, but because B and I were both in Exeter and Sina was in Berlin, we did have one day where B and I crafted paper flowers together while Sina painted graffiti on Zoom. And if we could, Martin, would you mind clicking on the YouTube link? Hopefully this is going to work because there's a little video of us doing that.
Can you see? Has that come up on the screen?
It hasn't, no.
It hasn't, right. I just need to swap the share over so that it gets that on. So hang on a second. There we go. And share.
Cool. Great. Could we go back to the PowerPoint, Martin?
That should be there.
Yeah, lovely. And then the next slide, if that's okay. Yeah, great, cool. Yeah, I can't
Get investing. In an AJ Bell, you invest stocks and shares
Oh,
ISA
Martin,
on
I
a
think that might
platform
be your
that gets
YouTube.
which recommended
Yeah.
year after.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Yeah, great. Yeah, I can't tell you how cool it was, how amazing it was to see that graffiti just emerge. It was beautiful, really nice. Yeah, okay, so so over time through the residency, then we found our conversations quite organically starting to revolve around recurring themes. Many recurring themes, I'm only going to mention one. I mean, there were lots of conversations that we had. But yeah, in particular, we became interested in how creativity leads to connection, sort of both with ourselves and other people in the world around us. So we talked a lot about how beneficial this kind of connection through creativity might be to well-being. And I've got a quote from Sina, actually. She said, well-being is a process of feeling connected with the people that I like, and connection is what gives me the joy of being alive. So because of this emerging theme, we then decided to go and read the poet Kay Tempest's book on connection, which I highly recommend if anyone's interested in it. And Kay Tempest defines creative connection as the use of creativity to access and feel connection and get yourself and those with you in the moment into a more connected space. So reading this then led us to further conversations about creative connection, and we spent considerable time in the second part of the residency and in the workshops that followed, at least the one that I was part of, which was Bees here in Exeter, thinking through creative connection and intersectionality, particularly in terms of the fact that carving out space and time for creativity through practice and conversation is a privilege not afforded to everybody. And also how carving out space to make and create with no fixed agenda could be an important kind of rebuff to sort of powerful intersecting systems of power. So I hope that gives you a sense of what exploring through practice meant in practical terms. And as I've mentioned, we explored all these things in a huge variety of ways, with themes and topics kind of like letting them just sort of organically emerge through trips to museums, reading books, crafting, painting, talking, a lot of talking. And increasingly, I also wanted to say that like increasingly something we realized was that one of the main ways we were exploring creative connection through practice was by connecting with each other, which was quite incredible considering the vast majority of this work was done over Zoom. But this was the main thing that came out of the residency for me, at least. I learned a phenomenal amount about working with artists, about the artistic process and about artistic and academic collaboration. But I guess the most important output was the creative connection between the three of us that we made through the residency, which is not very concrete and will likely never be a kind of appropriate output to like list in a funding application. But the benefits in terms of expanding my thinking as an academic and my imagination, my perspectives and values are immeasurable and will continue to influence my academic practice for years to come. So that's probably enough from me for now. But before I finish, I just need to mention this picture on the right hand side of the PowerPoint, which is Sina's phenomenal canvas that she painted during the residency, which admittedly was a very tangible and very beautiful product that emerged through the residency, as well as all the other kind of less tangible things that I've mentioned. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Sina, who's going to give her perspectives on the residencies.
Hello, everyone. Finally talking to you. Martin, could you move over for the next slide, please? So before we start, I'm Sina. I am Brazilian, and I've been living in Berlin for the last 2 years. Just giving you like a wide perspective of what I have been doing, because this is also important for how the residencies work. So I am a librarian. I study library sciences in Rio. And I also worked with technology for 7 years. I was a manager, a project manager. I did many things. And I started, so this, sorry, I'm a bit nervous. So this is the context for anyone that wants to contact me later. So this is my Instagram. There's my email there also. So if you have any doubts, if you want to like check out for some ideas, I'm totally available, and you can message me anytime you want. Then next slide, please. I want to talk about a bit of my library sciences formation. So my final paper was about graffiti. I started in graffiti in 2015 in a project called Afrografiteiras with Redinami, which is an NGO there that focus in using street art to fight against gender violence. And when I started to do graffiti in 2015, I also started with a lot of social projects. So I was always teaching, I've made a course, a 6-month course for teaching graffiti to women, but it was also like, we were also giving them workshops about racism in Brazil, history, Black feminism, and etc. And I also started to do workshops with kids in favelas. And so like always moving from a place to another. And then finally in 2018, I started in a project called Projeto Plataforma Casa, which is situated in a favela in the west zone of Rio called Aço. Favela means steel. And I've been working there until I left Brazil in early 2020. So when I was doing my final paper, I researched about how graffiti as a movement coming from the suburbs, coming from the favelas, could develop itself in a way that would contaminate, that would populate the whole paisagem, Jimmy. The whole
setting.
Yes, of the
landscape.
City. Thank you.
Yeah.
Landscape. Yes, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you all. Yes. The landscape of the city. So how can something that starts like with one person become something so massive in the landscape of a city that every big city you go, it has something. So I started to feel a bit more curious on how this was portrayed in the academia. And when I started to look for it, so this is me talking about the process of the research, right? So because I was curious with the art that I started to look for authors. So the bibliography that could lead me into the final research, the final paper itself. Because academia demands you to mention other previous published authors, right? So you have to have this formal thing about referring and being formal inside the universities, inside this box. And I noticed that most part of the things people were saying they were not graffiti writers. So I started to go myself to talk with the people who made graffiti happen. So can you move forward to the next slide, please? And because I was not satisfied only to hear them, I also started to record them. So this is some frames of a documentary that I'm producing based on my final paper for the bachelor's. And it's basically telling the story of graffiti in Rio and like how hip hop came and mix up all the things and how we survived through the movement and how the movement is actually a tool for saving people who doesn't have a lot of opportunities. So from left top to the bottom right. So in the first is Lolly, which is a friend of mine that I used to do. I was to be in the same graffiti crew that hers. the Power Pussy Crew graffiti crew.
Yeah.
It's made only for by female graffiti writers, and it was so nice because we were like moving all around the city making meetings, graffiti meetings where women would be the main characters and the producers and everything. And then on the right, there's Pandro Noban and Pablo Poderafro, which are siblings, and they were talking about how they started in the funk movement and how they used also, there was some fighting parties, let's say like this, and how this is also part of the feeling of belonging that they have. And then in the bottom left is Acme, which is a very, very big name in graffiti in Rio. And in the bottom right is Ana Paula Margem and Camis, which are also both graffiti artists and producers. And then next. So this, I started to talk about how, you can move forward, please. So Art for Me started in graffiti 2015, and then I had the need to bring it into academia, okay? So I kind of translated how I was feeling being inside of the movement into a very, very big paper, which was like over 200 pages. So I talked a lot about it. And then when in 2019, I got invited by Jimmy and the Global Grace Project to do these artistic residencies. I was invited actually to think a bit outside of the box because I was not used to think about masculinities because I'm a woman and I was always inside of this feminist movements and stuff. I was never invited. I was never starting my perspectives of thinking from masculinities. So and it was a bit like mind-boggling when Jimmy came to talk to us, because when we asked him what he wanted us to do in this project, he was like, no, I want to observe what you're doing. Same thing with Gemma in the second residency. I want to observe the process. I want to observe how you're doing. And this for us, it seemed too loose at first because we were used to have like, okay, I have this supplies, I have this material, I have this wall, I'm going to do this. So we think about like, even though it's art and it seems a bit like soft, imaginative, we kind of have some solid ideas of what we want to do because of the materials, because of the supplies that we have. And then when it's something very open like this, it got like a bit of a minute for us to understand how things were not expected to work, but how he wanted to observe. They wanted to observe this dynamics. And then something that I started to find very curious when we started the artistic residencies was the same process that I did with the graffiti inside of academia for my final paper in bachelor's was kind of the same steps that we were following in artistic residencies. So at first we have to collect the where are we going to start, right? The bibliography. So in my first research, I was reading books, I was reading articles. And in the artistic residencies, we started talking. So Jimmy, for example, he mentioned the Moonlight movie, which was something that we talked about a lot. And actually, I think it started because we were talking about how the colors made us feel, the colors and the photography of the movie. It was not about the subject itself. And then I think this is the main shift between researching formally and researching through art, is because when you get to the things that are going to fund be the funding of your research, you go to them because they move you and they make you feel something and they make you say something different. It's not necessarily you just mentioning somebody else's work. So this things that we have of like mentioning movies, mentioning events, going to museums, talking to different people. So at first in the Novella residency, there was a course happening along that was about masculinities, and it was like very, very important for me to go there because they gave me the fuel to get to my final picture. And then the process of researching is this, like talking to each other, exchanging informations about techniques and supplies and etc. And the results, when you have a final paper, for example, or an article in the academia, you have the final artworks or maybe a workshop. Can you please move to the next slide, please, Martin? So in 2019, we had connections with the Piranhas crew. They're from Medellin, Colombia. And this is also part of the process, like how you exchange and which different people come to you to talk to you. All of this, they become like pieces inside of the whole process of the research, and they can become something, they can collaborate in something in the final artwork. So, and one of the pieces that I produced in 2019 is the second in the bottom. And it's a piece that I used a bit of, this word, I don't know. So I've learned a bit of new techniques with plaster. Is this the word, plaster? So these leaves on the top, they're made of plaster and a mixture of paint. And it's something that I never had an idea, but because I had someone who gave me this idea and taught me this, I also learned the process. So the process of research in both ways, in the academia or in the artistic residencies, you always are learning from someone else. The funds, the people who are looking, the sources are changing, but the process is kind of the same. And then in 2021, when we made the past year, when we made the residency with Gemma and Bee, it was a bit, at first it was a bit like, how we're gonna manage this because we're so far and there's this COVID situation, and for you to interact with people, it's like better when you're in presence and stuff. So it was very nice the time that we spent online, but because we were talking about mental health and how creativity and the process of crafting together moved us towards a better path in our mental health, I also felt the need to make it in person. So I gathered in my house some friends of mine who are from different places, from gender nonconforming also and stuff. And then I created, I tried to reproduce the experience of the residencies, which is something that we're going to do later in the crafting session. So at first I created a breaking ice, which was food. Everybody likes good food. And then I've made feijoada, which is a Brazilian dish. Everybody ate a lot. And then while we were eating, we were talking, and like they were getting to know each other, because I knew everybody, but nobody knew, like almost nobody knew each other. And then I created a safe environment, and I gave them tools. I put all my art supplies on the table, paints, different papers, spray cans, anything they could find, anything. So they have in this position anything that they wanted to try, and I let them try. So here, the idea was to guide them through the tools, and the result could be whatever. You could like it or not. So it's more about experimenting than actually trying to get to a beautiful result. Can you go to the next slide, please? And then, so art provided us with a method of research, right? So we got the sources, we got the process of exchanging information, and we got the final piece of it together when it's pieced together. And I found that workshops and exhibits, they are the final form for you to spread the information, whatever you discovered. So this happened in 2019 with our exhibition in the end. But it also happened during the workshop here in Berlin that I've made with my friends, because since I invited them as part of a project that I was doing, we kind of went around off the theme sometimes. So the things that I've learned during the residency, I could actually talk to them about. And this is the process of how the circle of information is always running, right? You create something, you analyze it, you document it, and then you get to the result so you can learn and pass it towards. It's a cycle that never ends. And then I want to go for the next slide. Yes, so this in the left is, do you remember the social project that I said that I've been part since 2018 with kids? So these are the kids from this project, from the Instituto Casa. So because of the connections that I've made in Galpão Bela Maré and the place that was hosting us for the Nobela residency, I made a connection that I could actually use to bring the kids into the museum. So just to give you a kind of a notion, the favela that they live is like far from everything. Is like 2-something hours far from the center of the city. There's no cultural tools, there's no museums, there's barely schools, you know, it's very like, it's the poorest favela in Rio. So the conditions are very limited for them. And because I've met the people from the Galpão Bela Maré, they had a project where they were able to fund a visit from these kids to the museum, which was another museum inside of a favela. So this kind of mind blew them because they were not expecting to go to a museum inside of another favela. And it was not our exhibition, but it was also an exhibition produced by people who are gender nonconforming, who are Black, who have different sexual expressions, people who are artists in different ways and stuff. So it also gives them a perspective on looking forward, and look to art as also a work, as also a profession, as something that it's solid for you to pursue, you know. And then in 2021, past year, after we did a workshop that was called Intuitive Painting, I also was able to try something more intuitive, artistically speaking, because so coming from graffiti, something that is like very common is that you have to use anything you have in hands, because the supplies are usually very limited. You don't have money to buy cans because they're expensive. You don't have money to buy the canvas because they're expensive. You don't have money to basically anything. So you use anything you have in hands to do it. And then abundance is something that we are not very used to. Abundance of supplies, abundance of options, abundance of supports, you know, the things that Gemma was talking about, like how we were able to get the time to slow down and be an artist, being paid to be an artist. This is like a huge privilege that we're not used to. I'm not used to. And then past year, after we did this residency, I took all of my cans. I had no drawings in my mind. I just went to the wall and I did whatever I wanted. I just spent the time and just spent the cans. And this is something that is like a privilege that I was not, I'm not used to have. So it was like very interesting also to see how I can experiment instead of just looking for producing something beautiful. And then I ask you to go to the next slide again. And now I want to give you all the experience in a nutshell. Okay. This is where the fun begins, I promise. So what's the thing? I'm gonna propose an ice breaking for us. Do you want to say something, Martin, or?
Yes, yeah, I could do this. Yeah. So what we thought we'd do is Mel has kindly set up breakout rooms for us all. So we're going to shoot off into our breakout rooms, which will be the small groups that we're going to do our crafting in. And for maybe the first 2 or 3 minutes, we just want to have a game in a way, I suppose, as a way to sort of break down the sort of whatever nervous or other potential barriers there might be, which we're going to demonstrate now.
Yeah, I'm gonna explain to you very shortly.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the idea of this game is a kid's game, okay? So it's not difficult, everybody can do it. You don't need to feel shy, okay? It's all good. The thing is, we're gonna separate all of us in smaller rooms, okay? So we can look at each other. The idea is, we as a group, we have to count until 20, and somebody will start, another person will follow. It doesn't have an order, it doesn't have to follow any order, but in the moment that somebody says the same number at the same time, we have to start it again. Okay, there's no pressure on going to the final 20. Okay, there's no pressure at all. It's just for us, like, to get to know each other a little bit more. Okay, we're gonna demonstrate. So me, Martin, Jimmy, who else? Pat. Can we do it now then?
Just because I have a screen.
Okay, so I'm gonna look at all of you. Okay, can we?
Yeah, let's do it.
1,
2,
3,
4,
5,
6.
7.
7.
Ah.
Okay, so we start again. 1,
1, 1,
2.
3.
3.
Oh.
Okay, so everybody got the idea, right? Is there any doubts? Cool. So we move.
Great. Well, I hope everybody found that a nice way to break the ice. Cinna, did you want to just do a bit of table setting for what we're going to do right now?
Yeah.
Because we're going to go back into our groups, and then I think just because obviously we're running a bit
short
behind
time, right?
time, I think what we'll do is, if it's up to you, if you're okay with it, we'll keep, because the crafting seems to be the most important element of this. So I think we'll keep the time for that, and then maybe come back 5 minutes before the end, and then we can keep the line open for anybody that wants to share. Does that sound
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, good.
Okay, I'll hand it to you.
Also, thanks. Also, before we start the crafting session itself, I want to make an invitation for another 30 minutes after we finish everything. Nobody has to stay, okay? But you are invited to stay for another extra 30 minutes in the crafting, okay? So for the start, I ask you to bring any artistic supplies you had, and maybe an object that you found interesting. And I wanted to ask who brought something, but I think we don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to show you what I brought, okay? So I brought this little pot of glass with some rice inside. What the hell am I doing with? Playing music. Okay. If I want a different sound, I can use popcorn. Okay. But what I wanted to show you is what I'm gonna do for the crafting session today. I'm gonna explore, I'm gonna try. I've never did it before. I brought some hibiscus tea and coffee, and I'm gonna use it to try to paint something. Okay. So now we're gonna go to different smaller rooms, and I'm gonna go jumping from one to another to try to guide you through the supplies, and we'll talk to like in smaller groups so it's easier, okay? I see you soon.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Mel, are you okay to put us all back in our groups?
Yeah, sorry, just before we go to breakout rooms, Cinna, I don't feel entirely clear what we're supposed to be doing with our objects.
What did you brought?
So I've got a cup. I've got various things. I've got a little ladybird that was my grand's. So
I can't actually see it.
Oh, right.
Good.
So yeah, so what are the kind of basic instructions for us to get going?
Okay, so you have the objects, and which art crafts do you have?
So we've got felt tips, we've got colored pencils, we've got scissors, glue, paper.
You want to glue something and make it on your cup, for example. You can make a mask and put it in your cup as a puppet.
So what's the kind of what's the sort of basic instruction though? Are we trying to do anything in particular with our objects? We're trying to make.
You don't have to try to do anything specifically. You just have to try to change the original object with the tools that you have.
Okay.
It doesn't. You can glue something into it. You can try to imagine. For example, this is a cup, but what if I can change the function of it? Instead of being a cup, I can use it as a hat, as a puppet, as name it, you know?
Okay.
Try to think out of the box. It seems too loose now, but I think once I get into your rooms and see a bit more specifically what you have in hand, I can give you more specific tools.
Okay, so we're just trying to change our objects in some way. That's
yes.
Just to get us going. Okay, change them into change their function, change them into something else.
Changing something else. Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay.
So I think maybe before, because we're going to keep the line open for the next half an hour for anybody that wants to stay either to carry on crafting or to show what they've managed to put together or share their thoughts or reflections. Could we, I think, take the opportunity to thank our speakers and Cinna for a really brilliant session, both sort of talking and everything else.
Thank you.
Yes, it was a brilliant, insightful, very rich, wonderful, important paper and presentation that you gave, and then obviously the and sharing the crafting afterwards. I'll hold up what I was doing, which was trying to make a paper boat. So I could show and share that with my son at bath time. I have got halfway through. So
I can show you how to finish it.
Okay, brilliant. So what I might do is just, I mean, Cinna, Jimmy, or Gemma, did you have anything that you would like to say to sort of round off the official time before we sort of carry on, or would you like me just to sort of lead straight in?
I just want to quickly say a huge thank you to Martin, to Mel, and to the rest of the team at the Welcome Centre, both for inviting myself and Cinna, as well as Gemma, to join you today, but for the sterling technical work that you've all done. We presented you with quite a challenging format, and you've done a wonderful job. So thank you so much. And we've all heard from Martin, but Mel's been behind the scenes piloting everything. So thank you very much, Mel. Oh, there's her hand. She's waving. Fantastic.
Thank you very much for everybody that came, for Martin, for Mel. Thank you all, Gemma, for the invitation, Jimmy for coming also. It was so lovely. I really liked, and I hope you can join us for the next 30 minutes also.
And also to add another thank you to Amanda, our captioner. Another brilliant job under, hybrid sessions are always a bit of a nightmare and a challenge, but did brilliantly as always. So thank you.
Sorry, I meant to also.
No.
Sorry.
Great. So thanks everybody. We hope that we can see you in May for the next event. There will be more information sort of sent out. But for anybody that would like to stay with us, please feel free to sort of share your reflections and thoughts in the chat. Or if you've got any questions for Jimmy, Cinna, or Gemma, then please also put them in. Otherwise, I think the idea we're just going to carry on with the crafting, I think, and if anybody that does feel moved to speak as well, rather than just put it in the chat, feel free to unmute yourself and jump straight in. But otherwise, thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.